Buenas tardes a todos, me escuchan, ¿verdad? Bueno, pues bienvenidos, bienvenidas. En realidad las dos personas que nos acompañan hoy no necesitan presentación, pero como queremos hacerlas sentir muy bien recibidas con el protocolo adecuado, pues entonces voy a hacer una pequeña presentación, pero como sabemos no hace falta. Conocí personalmente a Mónica hace una semana y dijo algo así como, bueno, yo soy Monika Bielskyte y yo diseño futuros para vivir. Y yo dije, wow, qué declaración, qué tremenda declaración. Y bueno, creo que efectivamente eso es lo que ella hace, no mintió. Ella se dedica al diseño de futuros culturalmente diversos, comprometidos social y ambientalmente con el mundo para ciudades y empresas de tecnología. Su trabajo consiste en vincular la innovación tecnológica de vanguardia con las visiones creativas originales y es cofundadora de All Future Everything, agencia y plataforma para el prototipado de futuros. Y también hoy nos acompaña Gabriella Gómez Mont, que tampoco necesita presentación, pero igual voy a hacer lo que corresponde, para que no piensen que somos maleducados. Gabriela es fundadora del Laboratorio para la Ciudad, el brazo experimental del Gobierno de la Ciudad de México. Además de su fascinación por una amplia gama de temas urbanos, es periodista, artista visual, documentalista, consejera creativa de diferentes ciudades, universidades, compañías, miembro de think tanks. Ha sido galardonada con varios reconocimientos internacionales por su trabajo en diferentes campos. Y bueno, creo que necesitaría el resto de la conferencia para nombrar todos los premios que Gabriela ha ganado. Del mismo modo, es Senior Fellow, MIT Directors Fellow, Yale World Fellow, Institute for the Futures Fellow y World Cities Summit Young Leader. Y bueno, recientemente fue considerada como una de las 100 personas más creativas en el mundo por la revista Fast Company. Bueno, nuestras dos invitadas lo que van a hacer es una especie de viaje, van a guiar una reflexión acerca de cómo se pueden conjuntar la ciencia ficción y la realidad para abrir nuevas posibilidades. Mónica va a abordar el camino desde la ciencia ficción y Gabriela desde la realidad, y vamos a ver qué pasa con eso. Después de su presentación tendremos una ronda de preguntas y respuestas y después un pequeño cóctel, así que no se vayan, espero que hayan venido con tiempo, tenemos mucho de qué hablar. Y bueno, pues entonces cedo la palabra, adelante.
Bueno, hola a todos, yo soy Gaby Ríos, también del Laboratorio para la Ciudad. Y antes de cederle la palabra a Mónica y a Gabriela, nada más queremos platicarles que estos diálogos, provocaciones, ideas que ustedes van a escuchar forman parte del proyecto que le llamamos Futuros Urbanos, que estamos desarrollando en el Laboratorio para la Ciudad. Porque como una oficina experimental y de creatividad urbana, pues nosotros queremos reflexionar constantemente acerca de cuál es el tipo de ciudad que queremos construir y de cómo podemos transformar nuestro presente para poder materializar el futuro que beneficie a los habitantes de la ciudad. Y bueno, para explorar diversas visiones y posibilidades de futuro para esta ciudad, estamos llevando a cabo este proyecto en el cual este es el primer ejercicio de imaginación colectiva para poder generar distintas narrativas de la Ciudad de México en el año 2030. Entonces, en las siguientes semanas vamos a estar trabajando con diversos colaboradores, distintos actores que nos van a ayudar a imaginarnos estas otras realidades. Mónica es la primera invitada que tenemos, es la primera colaboración. Entonces, más que ofrecerles ahorita conclusiones finales o respuestas finales, lo que van a escuchar son primeras provocaciones, ideas e intuiciones de un experimento en curso y que iremos concluyendo en los siguientes meses. Y el tema más puntual, aunque también un gran tema y difícil de abordar, que estamos tratando con Mónica, es el tema de la creatividad. Entonces nos estamos imaginando cómo queremos que la Ciudad de México en 2030 sea una ciudad más creativa. ¿Cuál es el rol que queremos que la creatividad juegue en nuestra vida? ¿Cómo puede moldear la experiencia de la urbe? Y bueno, entre otras grandes preguntas que van a estar contestando ellas.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Antes de empezar, les tengo una pregunta obligada. Mónica quiere esta grabación para una investigación que está haciendo y también para compartir con su gente en Estados Unidos, entonces pensábamos hacerla en inglés. ¿Alguien tiene algún problema que estemos hablando en inglés? Ok, nadie, perfecto. So, English it will be. Y antes de pasarle el micrófono a Mónica, que va a empezar, les cuento que este es un experimento sobre un experimento. Es, por una parte, la primera vez que abrimos un diálogo tan nacente del laboratorio que justamente apenas está empezando, paradójicamente porque nosotros estamos concluyendo, pero justo pensábamos que no podemos dejar estos 5, casi 6 años de gobierno sin realmente intentar plantear cómo vemos una visión para la Ciudad de México desde el laboratorio. Entonces, como bien decía Gaby, vamos a estar invitando a varias personas y el diálogo que van a ver con Mónica es probablemente el más experimental de todos, justo porque es el más usado, porque tratar de entender la realidad de una ciudad desde la ficción obviamente requiere sus buenos saltos cuánticos. Entonces, bienvenida Mónica, ella va a dar una pequeña presentación desde la ficción. Como bien se mencionaba, yo empezaré desde la realidad y luego justamente entablaremos un diálogo abierto, sin conclusiones, y que nos encantaría que participaran para poder pensar en voz alta, imaginar en voz alta durante este encuentro. Así que, welcome Monica, and it's all yours.
Muchas gracias, soy muy contenta de ser aquí. I'll have to switch to English, although I love Spanish and understand most of it. Okay, we need to...
Perdón, es que creo que tanto Mónica y como yo no somos rápidos.
There's always issues with clickers everywhere, no matter. It's not a conference if there's no issues with clickers. Is it working right now? So, I want to speak about fictional futures for real cities. And what does it mean to think about that? Fictional futures, not fictional future. I believe there is no one future, only possible futures. And similarly, there are no answers, only choices. So I'm labeled a futurist more often than not. That's what apparently sells today, that's the trendy thing. I like to think of myself more as a future designer. Predicting is just a tiny part of what I do. Usually, to predict, you look the street you stand on, you observe people, you listen to what is being said, and you predict more of the same. And as Ray Bradbury says, I want better. So for me, it's really about seeing what is happening, what are the possible avenues, and then how we could actually actively shape them with the choices that we are making today. Where do these choices come from? It really starts with ideas that we have about the future. It really starts with our thoughts in how we see ourselves in the world and of the world. And how is that way we see ourselves in the world and of the world informed? By many things, of course, by our personal experience so much. But if there's one factor that is maybe most important in the way we conceive the futures, in the way we sometimes maybe do not question the futures, in the way we grow accustomed to futures, it is media. And media is so much the modern day mythology. It informs the foundations of our civilization, and sometimes even values and policies for generations to come. We're not yet there. We don't yet have brain-computer interfaces. In the lab, yes, not maybe actively in people that do not necessarily specifically need them. We're not yet wearing the contact lenses, we're just trying out, we're early stage in VR, AR, and yet our minds are so much affected by what we consume as media, as well as what we consume as interactions and food and all that stuff. So, why science fiction? A lot of people think that I've been a sci-fi nerd or a sci-fi fan forever. I'm actually not. I love it, of course. But really, what I'm a fan of is reality. And what I found, and here I'm going to paraphrase an incredible American-Nigerian writer, Nnedi Okorafor, science fiction world design is one of the most powerful forms of political writing. So she speaks how for her science fiction writing is political writing. And for me, it's really the world design. So let's look in certain recent examples, just of the last year, of the kind of world design that we've seen. Altered Carbon, Blade Runner 2049, Ghost in a Shell, Hollywood version. So what do we see? We see dystopian cities, we see polluted cities, we see objectified female body. We see loneliness, we see single hero journey, we see violence. As my friend Lori Penny says, cultures are defined not only by the stories they tell, but also the ones that they don't. So it's important to think not just what's being shown, but also all these things that are omitted. I actually want to look, I just added this yesterday. What happens when you search for sci-fi city on Google? So these are the images that come up. Again, mostly dystopian, mostly dark, mostly the high towers. Very few examples of kind of green futures, but even those green futures are very much corporate dystopia green futures. What happens when you type in futuristic city? So it's slightly, we step out from sci-fi, we sort of think a bit more realistic, futuristic, and even you put a tag utopia. So you actually actively search for something that is positive vision. Yet once again, it's the high towers, we see more sunlight, we see more green, but it's very hard to imagine that as our reality. It almost completely omits actually what cities are today, what communities are today. And so I want to look into what these dystopian futures lack, and then maybe somehow we could come back to it in what type of future imagination we need more in the way we think and create futures for ourselves and our very real cities. Point number one, dystopia lacks diversity. Cultural diversity, of course, of course, of course. We continuously see entire groups of people, entire continents, entire cultures being omitted from future narratives. Gender diversity. We are still stuck, although we can imagine intergalactic space travel, we're still stuck with gender binary and heteronormative relationships and families. We continue seeing objectified female body, as you've noticed from the previous examples, and we continue seeing sort of alpha male characters as the only possible representation for what men could be in the future. There's very little of anything that would be in the spectrum. There's very little of anything that would break the stereotypes. But also, let's not forget, it's also diversity of abilities. We live in an ableist society that excludes people that are differently abled. And we keep seeing, although we can imagine brain-computer interfaces and exoskeletons and so many amazing technologies that could empower so many among us that we currently do not see as much in our cities. Yet in the future, they continue being omitted. Community narratives, again and again, single hero journeys, rather than stories of communities coming together. Not just despite their differences and their diversity, be it cultural, generational, gender, of abilities, but actually for that diversity. Values evolution. We continue seeing future depictions that are sort of late-stage capitalism society. It's interesting because I was just rereading Noah Yuval Harari's Homo Deus, and how he speaks in the way that some of these ideologies seem inevitable because so many webs of stories of meaning have been created around it. But in fact, yes, these webs are being spun and become so tight and tight that we cannot see outside them. Yet with time, and any historian can tell you, they do unravel. So can we imagine futures based on different value system? Environmental awareness, again, whenever these stories that are on a big screen, stories that are being seen by hundreds of millions of people, they always are about lack of environmental awareness and environmental consciousness, rather than novel ways that we could live as truly connected and linked with the environment and could start seeing ourselves, not man and the nature, but us as part of the nature, part of everything, and that everything being within us as well. Body reimagined and sensuality. So many lonely stories, so many stories of fighting, so many stories of killing. Where are the stories of loving? And loving not cyborg or an AI. I mean, her, I'm looking at you, right? But actually loving each other, actually interacting with each other, actually dancing with each other, actually making love with each other, not having sex, abusive sex with cyborgs. Touching each other. How much of that can we see? And can we also imagine, when we think of all these futuristic technologies and all that our bodies would be able to do, and how much we'd modify ourselves, how that would change our relationship with our physicality? Ritual and spirituality, another key point. When I give talks in the Western world, some people are like, huh? What does even ritual mean? However, whenever I talk in places like India, Africa, people are, of course, that is crazy. How come spirituality is not part of the future tense? And rituals, of course. Celebration. And the last but not least, and maybe the most important for me, creativity, youth, and street culture. So even in these utopian visions that I showed, that are green and sustainable and supposing circular economy, where is the youth? Where's the street culture? Where is the creativity that does not conform? So, we saw what is lacking, and how much representation matters. Why it matters? Because these fictions that we tell bleed back into reality. A lot of these dystopian scenarios and dystopian visions become a product roadmap. There's interesting parallels between authoritarians and engineers, and it's very much due to pedagogy. And so we must be aware how we do not fetishize dystopia. Some cautionary tales are very important, but we cannot have just that. We have to imagine a paradigm shift. Speaking about representation, here is another example, and it came out of the conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, Kayus Bankole from Young Fathers. And there's an incredible video that they've done. YouTube it if you can. It's just type in National Portrait Gallery, Young Fathers. And he speaks about the lack of representation in our galleries and museums. And he asks, he's a Nigerian Scottish man, and he asks, if I don't see a picture like myself, does that mean I do not exist? And so, let's speak about Google. Again, Google, hope you hear me. When I type in eyes in Google, these are eyes that come up. There's only one black person and one possibly mixed race person in there. How many people proportionally in this world or in this room have blue eyes? Blue eyes are beautiful, of course, but how much of the population has blue eyes? Yet how many blue eyes we keep seeing here? How many Asian person's eyes we see? This is Google, this is not even Pinterest or anything like that. When I type in lips, that is what I see. These are all lips of white people. These are all lips with lipstick. These are all, again, objectified female lips. There are no lips of people of color. There's no lips of kids. There's no lips of men. Why? We would associate lips only with women and only with white people. So for me, an important thing is that technological progress without humanitarian evolution always equals dystopian future. We have to think of humanitarian values while we think of technology. We have to think of cultural innovation and technological and social innovation together. And my key two things is that nostalgia is poison, but also fuck techno-fetishism. We cannot go back. We cannot be a Luddite. We have to use all the tools that we have, and technology is one of them. But we cannot fetishize the future. We have to find a way, how do we negotiate these tenses, past, present, and future, in a way that does not erase either of them and does not erase any of us. Innovation is not a gadget. Innovation is not a shiny new thing. Innovation are actually innovative ideas that change our society for the better. So for me, the real challenge today is to imagine a future that has hope in it. And the hope cannot be in technology. The hope has to be in humanity. And I believe that there's a way to bridge past and future with grace and without resorting to nostalgia or erasing the heritage entirely. The first beautiful example of that being done is Black Panther. Whoever hasn't seen it, do your homework. It's a superhero movie, yes, it's a Marvel movie, yes, but what they've done with world design is phenomenal. They managed to bring together high technology, futuristic city, and environment. They managed to imagine, again, the most innovative ways of living, yet not forgetting the ritual. They managed to see how the life at the top level, at the top floor, up in high rise can coexist with the street level without demonizing it. They managed to bring in humanity and love and really shift the perception also of men and women within that narrative. So I could speak for hours about it, but they even had, oh my God, they even had an equivalent of an ayahuasca ceremony in it. Now this is a movie that is going to be seen by hundreds of millions of people, by kids, and they're opening their mind to that. So my point is really that creatives have a key role in designing tomorrow. There are two interesting definitions of creativity, and Isabel Benke, a mutual friend of ours, incredible woman, a primatologist, has spoken about. And it's really that innovation, it's about application of innovative ideas. But creativity is really about birthing new ideas and novel ways of being and seeing. So creativity is not enough. We need to apply it. But it always starts with creativity. And so I look forward to discussing further that in context of Mexico City.
So this was the provocation that Monika left me with when she gave me her presentation. What is the future we can dream together? And in the context of starting from the too much reality, this is where we start with, because we don't start in blank. And yes, we cannot necessarily romanticize the past, but I do think that we need to go back to it and revisit what we once were as well, and to really figure out, from the examples that we have at hand, what can we rescue? What do we think of the urban DNAs? In many senses, one of the things that we've been thinking about right now in the lab, since we've been working with a couple of communities in Xochimilco, is that nowadays one of the most forward-thinking thing happening in agriculture is agroponics, and strangely enough, it's actually inspired by exactly this, by the chinampas that are almost 600 years old. So, urban DNA, and I think that urban DNA has to do absolutely with doing this very difficult task of sinking the hands into the city, of figuring out what it has been, but also what it can become. Because Mexico City, besides, is unstable, it's uncertain, we cannot necessarily make it sit still, and that is Mexico City, and that is Mexico City, and that is Mexico City, and this is Mexico City. And Mexico City is 60% constructed in its origins, which actually means that the city that we have right now was also just as imagined as the city that I saw, and that the Spaniards saw when they came across the city. So one of the questions that we've been asking continuously is, how do you enter a city? How do you even start when you have something like that? And I have the feeling that in these last years, in these last decades, modernism has been a little bit too prevalent. And we've been thinking about cities as machines. Think cities that are meant to be productive, that are made to be efficient, that are made to speed humanity ahead into its future. But modernism's values have also completely imploded in our hands, I believe, and we have to start thinking once again, can we imagine a city from a different place? Can it be much more multidisciplinary? Can it slip away from our hands and yet still be something that we can think about and play with? So that interesting, challenging task has been a little bit of what we've been doing at Laboratorio para la Ciudad. For those of you who don't know the lab, it's the experimental office / creative think tank of the Mexico City government. We've been up and running almost for 5 years. We started a little bit later than the rest of the government. And As you probably might know, we are part of a family of labs internationally, of government labs embedded within government that basically try to deal with this huge paradox that on one hand, as citizens, we rightly want our governments to be solid and sure-footed, and at the same time, we really need to have vehicles for new ideas and new people and new methodologies to come in to the business of government, especially when you think of government not necessarily only as this bureaucratic, huge, lethargic thing, but actually a place where you can access every point of the city, that you can access everything that has to do with how we come together as a society. So one of the biggest particularities that the lab has vis-a-vis the rest of the other government labs is a highly multidisciplinary team. So we continuously ask a question very relevant here to the creative cities thing, is what happens when we bring humanities back into the conversation? What happens when it's yes architects and yes city planners and yes engineers and yes water experts, but also artists and designers and filmmakers and writers and editors and activists looking at the city again? And this is actually the composition of my team. All of those profiles that I just mentioned, and then the other half is made of people that you'd find a little bit more common in the city conversation. Urban geographers, political scientists, social scientists, data experts, et cetera, et cetera. And everything that we do sits in between this slightly uncomfortable but very interesting space. The other even more uncomfortable space that we sit between is government and civil society. As you know, there's a huge mistrust nowadays between institutions and the societies that they serve. So we also need to bridge this quite creatively and have really been thinking about intensely what happens if we start reinventing and reimagining political languages in urban forms. Can that actually make this little space into a strange attractor where people can gather? What makes us more unique, though, is this city. Because, you know, one of the first labs was born in Copenhagen, the other one in Helsinki. As you can imagine, these are very different cities, both of, first of all, the size, everything that we do is in superlatives, as anybody and everybody in this room knows. You know, 21 million people, metropolitan area, 9.5 people city proper, 5 million people riding a subway. When we have a doble no circula, it rises to 9 million. I found out when I was working in government. And then the other thing is that when you think about the city, the amount of resources is so vast. Like the repertoire of urban commons is huge, but so are the challenges. So in a certain sense, we need to think about both the diversity in its positive sense, but also the huge challenges that inequality also gives. Like having some of the world's richest billionaires living in the city, but also one of the lowest minimum wages, not only of the OECD, but actually Latin America. So what do you do with this? How do you enter the city? How are you a lab? What are the questions that you ask the city first? So basically the place that we've been trying to hold is this, between the urban, the political, the social, the creative, of really trying to think about the tensions and the translations, that, as I mentioned, the new urban languages and political forms, and basically try to think about those tensions in its creative aspect, as generative and not necessarily as explosive. We also hold this weird space of the gap between things, so we specialize in the gaps, as funny as that is to say. The conversations that are not being had in the rest of their government, there's 280,000 other civil servants in the Mexico City bureaucracy, believe it or not. The conversations that are not being had, the disciplines that are not necessarily present, the voices that are not being heard. And we're also incredibly intrigued about what it means to actually bring in the creative ethos into the business of thinking about cities. This is our rooftop, the lab. There's several people here from my team, and that we call this home. This place was the first little place that we try to free up, not only for services and complaints, which is usually what government buildings are for, but for ideas and debates. So there we've hosted a series of people, yes, some mayors and other persons, but also people such as Perry Chen, who is the co-founder of Kickstarter that raises $1.5 million per day for creative projects, as you probably know. So really trying to bring in other ideas or the profiles. As a good lab, we work in the context of experiments. And this has to do everything from passing laws, such as the open city law that we passed. It's actually a dynamic law that can update itself, which is what you get when you put creative people to think about lawmaking, I guess. But one of the things that we're also incredibly intrigued by is what I call the theory of un, dos, tres por mí y todos mis compañeros. Like, how do you actually be a team of 20 people, but then let a lot of other people in that have not necessarily been interested in collaborating with government? One of the more serious, if you will, works that we've been doing lately, that Gabi is also coordinating, is what we're calling Seminario, which is 5 universities as well as people from civic tech working on solutions for the city, of when we found out what the biggest challenges that people thought were like. So we like to prototype collaborative societies. We love, and these are 3 examples of these collaborative tables that we've been working on, of young people using artificial intelligence, but instead of using it for Las Lomas, it's actually the first thing that will have optimized routes with artificial intelligence and GPS are going to be the routes that actually feed the most marginalized communities in Mexico City, the SM1. So what does it mean to actually have that benefit another part of society? Another project that we love is air quality. Right now, Mexico has been measuring air quality for the last 21 years, but it's always high towers and we need pedestrian readings and we need dynamic readings. So these guys actually, because they've been working with the Ministry of Environment, already have a really cheap open source prototypes that can actually measure some really important components of that. Now we're going to have very cheaply be able to integrate these readings and crowdsourced readings into the official system. We also have younger people working with Médico en tu Casa, where other places are still asking about if you don't have medical insurance, should you just, die on the streets, or what do you do in other countries? Here we actually have more than, I think it's almost 500 doctors making house visits to the people in the most marginalized communities, but usually the recipes get jotted down on a paper and then get thrown away. So basically what we're doing is gathering the data on all of this, and now the CENTRO de Ciencias Complejas de la UNAM is actually working with them to basically throw this into these readable and as well as researchable things where we can start thinking about what is happening in the city. So those are the objective topographies that the lab deals with, which we think are important, and these realities that are urgent and pressing. But at the same time, we think that we cannot get stuck in the realities of the present, which is a little bit why we're starting this conversation of urban futures, if you will, to basically open up the imagination. And we really think that this space of objective topographies and social imaginaries that the city is full of basically gives us another infrastructure that we rarely talk about in terms of urban planning, which is the symbolic infrastructure of the city, the way that we create meaning, the way that we belong to places, the way that we are or we aren't a community. So things, and here I will show a very quick repertoire of things that we've been thinking about. These are not complete projects and belong to many cities across the lab that have their own theories of change and strategies, but for example, world hinting. How can certain laws and legal frameworks that are in Mexico City, this is a 17-year-old transvestite, a 17-year-old transsexual that was able to get a sex change because of the laws that we have in Mexico City. So what does she represent for the type of societies that we want in terms of this diversity that we're thinking? And this is legal frameworks actually being able to press forward social and urban realities. But then on the other hand, and pressing a little bit further into the creative fields that you guys belong to, what happens when you get somebody like Gilberto Esparza, that I'm sure many of you know, that works on plantas nómadas, for example, which is this incredible contraption which is half plant, half robot. It has hydrophiliac legs, so it means that it can find rivers on its own, and it walks towards rivers. It takes for granted that water is polluted, so out of this thing, it can take water, and then it purifies it, feeds the plant in turn feeds the robot, and if anybody goes towards the robot, it runs away. And it can live for about 1 month in the wild. So imagine this in the communities around the rivers that are actually polluting the rivers, and being able to talk to kids and to even adults about the necessity of taking care of their environment, not under a scientific and moralistic point of view, but basically through these types of contraptions. What type of world hinting is that? What type of city can we imagine? And this, I think, is one of the questions that has very much intrigued us. What type of society do we want, and how do we get there? And suddenly there are very big questions, and I throw it back into the policy field, which is the Constitution of Mexico City, which basically, if there's any policy wonks in here, because my half of my heart is now so happily a bureaucrat that I am still completely surprised that I get overjoyed by these things. But the Mexico City Constitution actually brought up a lot of the things that the city has earned: euthanasia, transsexual rights, gay marriage, adoption, etc., onto a constitutional level. And for whoever asks why is that important, we just have to look across the border into the US and see an answer. Yes, this is important. Constitutions are important, and they do create other realities. It's also captured in a way, we help crowdsource part of the Constitution, and we're able to bring in more than 500,000 people into a process that was seen as more specialist. And I'll just give one example of one of the methodologies that we used was joining forces with change.org, finding people where they already are, and then basically helping them mature their ideas, and now happily more than 78% of the ideas that were presented through these methodologies and matured with many meetings face-to-face are now in the Constitution, including of 17-year-old kids that don't even have the age to vote right now, and have their ideas in the Mexico City Constitution. So, yes, objective, but then I go back, because as you can see, I go back and forth between the objective city and the subjective city. The future is also subjective. One of the other things that we did with the Constitution was basically ask 31,000 people across the city about their urban imaginaries, as we call them. What are the first 3 words that come to mind? What are your big loves of the city? What is it that most pains you? What do you imagine as an ideal future of the city? What did the government need to do, and what did you need to do for this to happen? And now we can navigate all of this data by gender, by age, by neighborhood, and it's been an amazing thermometer for the projects of the lab, and actually out of this came the projects that I showed you, as well as assigning with more than 5 main universities of Mexico City that are now dealing with the challenges. In terms of futures, we found really interesting things and questions that we need to answer, and that we'd love your help in answering them. When we asked about futures, even though we were pressing for ideal utopic futures, we got back mostly dystopic visions. Mad Max, you know, the movies, film has actually done their thing with our head, and we are stuck in the reality of the present and in the urgency of the present. But nowadays we can now map, for example, people that think that the water is the biggest threat of Mexico City, the biggest asset, but then we can also overlay this with possible futures that people are imagining in terms of water. So how do we start activating this subjective imagination with these objective truths and pressing concerns? One of the things that also intrigues me, that is also up in the Constitution, is the right to the city that blends both of these spaces really neatly, which is basically the right to the city under legal terms and human rights is that this city should be meant for anybody. If you're a 3-year-old kid, if you're a single mother, if you are a 60-year-old person with a terminal disease that would prefer to die because you're gonna die anyway, the city should be yours. But at the same time, we can go back to Henri Lefebvre and we can go back to David Harvey, and then suddenly it opens up all sorts of possibilities, because what they say is because we imagine the city, and then in turn, the city makes us, then basically the ultimate right to the city is the right to imagine the city and make it come true. So what happens when we try to bring these both legal as well as provocative frameworks back? How do we step into the city once again? One of the things that the urban geography department at the lab has been doing is trying to give us a little bit more explanation of how to enter that city and how to understand it. This, I had no idea before stepping into government, is a map of the kids across the city. So in places like this, we can suddenly find that there's almost 500,000 kids only in Iztapalapa. Just Iztapalapa, and there's actually 5 million kids on a metropolitan area, which is basically the population of Helsinki. But now you can start seeing what this looks like. And then you can go deeper to try to find solutions and things. This is a map also created at the lab where you can cross concentration of kids block by block across the city. And you can cross it with access or lack of access to open and public space, and then cross it again with indexes of inequality and marginalization. So basically we start getting hotspots, and then we start asking, what do we do? Like, what do we do, yes, with a vision for a megalopolis, but what do we do with these micro territories that we need to intervene, because there is no way that we can just like grasp Mexico City as a whole or solve Mexico City as a whole, for better or for worse. So then come some of the answers. Jugar la Ciudad was an exploration across the city of what is, if we take into account the right to play that the Mexico City citizens have and the right to the city for kids, what is the state of affairs for playgrounds across the city? And then figuring out that we're creating playgrounds where there are no kids and vice versa. And at the same time, because we want to open up not only a policy thing, and this is actually now part of the urban plan of Mexico City, of defining for the first time the typography of playgrounds, what do we do with places like this? And how can we bring other people into the conversation? First of all, the kids. Like, how do the kids have a part in designing their places and in the policy? How do we design tools to make them part of the equation? But also, how do we bring in artists and designers and such? And this is Juguetes Urbanos, that we're just deploying the first 2 winners, where we invited people to actually propose these types of typologies, where we can really reinvent the way that public space is being used. And now we have this and other examples that are out there in the city center right now and that have had amazing repercussions. Like, one of them is falling apart a little bit because we didn't know that it was going to be so heavily used, and now it turns out that the kids themselves have become a guardian and they're fixing them up in their own way. So, you know, how does this hackable city that is not perfect actually become a thing in and of itself when there's a creative intention, when the community is brought in? But we're not only intrigued by the professionals and their creativity when imagining a city. One of the other things that we've been quite impressed with is one of the programs that has existed for more than 10 years, which is Mejora tu Barrio, where community people in the most marginalized areas of Mexico City will be given money. They can propose a project and then they will be handed over money so that they can create different types of projects. The thing is, and some very amazing projects have come out of this, such as Chavos Banda, which basically in the 90s, when a lot of people from the gang members were being killed across the city, what they did once they got super frightened with this is like saying we need to actually be not part of the problem, but part of the solution. And they've created one of the most amazing cultural spaces that has had one of the biggest success stories in terms of reinsertion of people, getting them out of gangs and bringing them in to a cultural institution, to sports institutions, etc., etc. Another one is a lot of communities doing now, growing their own food, being organic, etc., etc. So there's a huge potential there. And what we've been trying to do is basically saying, how can we instigate further the imagination? First of all, by turning these boring things into, returning it to the city, telling the stories, letting this contagious effect of places that have been quite successful become better known. This is an amazing example. I don't know if some of you heard that a couple of years ago in Finland, they tried this super successful experiment of merging a senior citizen home with a kindergarten with super, super amazing results. Well, one of the poorest communities in Mexico City did that about 7-8 years ago with money from Mejoramiento Barrial. So this is the type of city that we're imagining. How do we map that city? How do we let people know the projects that are created around it? How do we create that contagious effect? And how do we also create instruments for policy people to be able to better understand the decisions that are being made, and turning this, which is the numbers that come out, into data that are for specialists that they can also read. So this is about giving everybody tools to be able to imagine the city better. And so ending and starting to wind up, I really do think that Mexico City could be an experimental ground for these type of urban futures. We have to work with what we have. There is no way that the city is going to disappear. We will never become, for better or for worse, those images that you showed. We will not even become who we used to be. But what is it that is possible within this fabric? And what is it that is possible when we start thinking together? We recently also concluded the Article 20 of the Constitution that we worked with Ingeniero Cárdenas and his team, which includes things such as sanctuary city. But first of all, we started asking people, we asked more than, I think, 200 people about what they thought was the greatest potential of internationalization of Mexico City, which was both talking about what we think of ourselves, but also an introspection. And it turned out it's the creative and diversity. So it's not only people from the creative fields that find a huge wealth there, but actually people from other fields of saying this could actually be part of the very, very intimate DNA of Mexico City. And so to conclude, a creative office within government, because that is what we are, why and how and for what. And so basically I'd say that one of the things that has provoked us the most is if, during modernist times and during these stereotypes that we talked about cities, it was fine for government to be a provider of services and everything that it did. But now I think with these new paradigms, and these cities that are not only built for the human body, but also for the human imagination, we need to start thinking of government offices that also catalyze human talent and that help us imagine and sometimes, yes, maybe think about urban futures with our amazing guests. So thank you very much.
So I first saw Gabriella talk at C2 in Montreal, and I've heard about her through several mutual friends. But it resonated with me so much. And what also struck me is why and how come I have not heard these words, these ideas, or that conversation happening elsewhere. So I coined this equation, smart future plus creative future equals regenerative future. And we do know that by now, we realize that we've been this destructive force. We need to become sustainable civilization, but that is not enough because so much damage has already been done. So we have to aim to become regenerative intelligence. And what really, really struck me again is that whenever we talk about future cities, it's smart cities, and it's about efficiency and connectivity and productivity, and we completely omit this conversation about who we are as emotional, creative animals, who we are not as logical machines, but really as people. And it was also quite uncanny because as preparing for this talk, Gabriella shared with me a bunch of her writing, and especially some things from years back, even before Laboratorio para la Ciudad. And at some point I was like, oh my God. Like, it was uncanny. It felt like I was reading not just my own thoughts, but even my own writing. So I was like, I just hope that I'm not gonna mix up and take in one of the phrases and just assume it was mine. But what's interesting is that we come from these very different backgrounds. I come from the world of fiction, yet for me, the way I use fiction is ultimately it's not science fiction for science fiction's sake. It's not world design for the fictional world design. It's not aesthetics for aesthetics. It's really about affecting the real world and the lives of real people, and representation matters for me because I know that it literally, the lack of it kills people, and when we finally have more of it, it saves lives and it gives people opportunities. So I think further down in the conversation, it'd be so interesting to explore how we come from these different angles, yet not only that there is a meeting point, there's an absolute convergence and these sort of vortex of ideas and desires for a future that is much more inhabitable and inspiring. So should we go on to the whole creativity talk? Okay, so we try to decide what is the timeline for our collaboration, and we settled down for 2030. And because I'm the first invited futurist, and I'm a futurist invited to think about the future of creativity. So my background, of course, is in media, in all forms of media, immersive media, augmented, virtual, mixed reality, future of content, future of experiences. But what we set ourselves as a task is really to think what creativity would mean for this future city context. What it could encompass, how we could think of it not just as attached to artistic disciplines, yet at the same time do not fall into the trap of sort of Davos World Economic Forum definition of creativity. The most required skill for the top CEOs is creativity. And in that case, it becomes almost, creativity is the skill to sell more stuff that people do not need. So I've written down in this last few days a few ideas around creativity, and I'll throw these out as provocations. So personally for me, I come from a small town in North Lithuania, and there was very little creativity or creative setting or diversity around me. I felt like a really weird child. I felt a bit isolated. I felt like a black sheep. And for me, creativity was very much survival tactics. It wasn't something that was a thing to do. On the contrary, that was something that made you be bullied at school. And so inventing these other worlds in my own head to start with, and then via writing and designing and arts, was a means to imagine another possible reality. And coming back to Isabel Benke, what really interested me is how she speaks about playfulness and the vital need to play as something that relates us with plenty of other species that also inhabit this planet. But I'm interested in how, as much as we are connected by playfulness, maybe that one thing that humans distinguish themselves with is creativity. So we are playful animals, but the creativity is very much what defines us as species. And then,
I'm trying to turn on its head the Descartes phrase and sort of move from I think, therefore I am, to we create, therefore we can be. And so this idea that we became humanity, we became civilization through creativity, through sharing the knowledge, through imagining new possibilities. And the only path to survival, into overcoming the problems, into moving into this paradigm shift, again, comes through creativity. So how do we go from there? We create, therefore we can be.
So it's interesting to me to hear you speak about this world in the head. First of all, because I think that so many of us that actually dedicated ourselves later on to the creative fields come from that space in which you cannot necessarily get away with not creating this world and not having that be your way of dealing with loneliness. But suddenly when you grow up, it's like, how do I let more people in? How do I have the city that I'm building in my head actually become something out there that other people can step into? And I've always also found very interesting that suddenly we've had the poets and the people from literature, everything from Calvino to Rilke, talking about the place of cities, and let's say Rilke saying, that every time you see a city or you see an urbanscape, in a certain sense it gets constructed in your head and then maybe becomes invisible outside because it's the city in your head that you start to inhabit instead of the one outside. And is it not the objective of every city to become invisible someday? And funnily enough, now neuroscientists are also proving this to be true. Like our built environment has a huge effect on the way our emotions, but also our neural circuits actually play out. So I have the feeling that, that even idea of the city as a story to enter, which will bring me to some of the things that are provoking thoughts in my head of even how to enter this subject is, so we cannot have an urban future for Mexico City that is monolithic, because we've seen it. Like, this is too much of it's a beast that will not stay still. Too many of us are here. And rather, I actually think that a place like this is possibly a place to accommodate as much possibility as possible, valga la redundancia, that it is a place that should prompt more and evoke more, that one can place oneself into a story and enter that story from many different angles with many different resources, instead of like this monolithic stories that other cities are playing out. Like places like London and New York that I have been in love with half my life are now actually having an exodus of people that used to live very differently to what they live now, just because basically it's unaffordable. And I know that, so I'd have two things to throw on the table and to think out loud with you. First of all is, how do you do that? Like when the fiction landscapes for film are so there and so prevalent, how do we also let it slip away, if you will? How do we create experimenting cities, which basically what they prompt is that sense of exploration and of you finding, as Italo Calvino would say, the answers to your own questions instead of the city answering them, with a period and that's it. And the second one, I forgot what the second one was, so you can just go on with the first.
So, as a futurist and future designer, what I'm known for is really my passion for, again, representation and diversity. And my focus very much on future visions from the perspective of the global south. Because precisely I feel way not enough people are focusing on that. And this thinking comes very much from a conversation with my Indian friends and collaborators. And a friend of mine, Malvendra Singh Shekhawat, when I was there said, India was never a country, it was an idea. And we don't live in this one timeline, we don't live in this one layer, we live in multiple centuries at a time. And he perceived it as a bit of a struggle, though also could see it as an opportunity. But for me, as a future designer, that was the most fascinating thing. And so what bothers me, and also what sort of disinterests me with maybe the global north, or the classically sort of North America, minus Mexico, or Europe, is that we seem so much to be living in one slate of time. We deny
so much that elements of the past still exist in the present. And our future is completely anchored in that one uniform present. And so I think when you think of designing future cities, especially imagining fictional cities, and what made the design of Wakanda by Ryan Coogler, Hannah Beachler, Ruthie Carter so incredible is that they've done massive research. They spent a lot of time in Africa, and they spent a lot of time also thinking where African diaspora comes into that creation of a fictional, never colonized country within the continent. And that's what I do. And so when I started doing research for our project and just looking into all the different layers and aspects of Mexico City, from pre-Hispanic to colonial, to different areas within the city, to different cultures and subcultures, that's what makes it exciting. And so imagining these cities that make, for me, a creative city is a city that makes diversity desirable. A creative city is a city that makes diversity desirable. It's not about, let's tolerate our difference. Let's truly embrace them. And that difference is not just individuals that inhabit, but also these different times and different modes of existing coming from different centuries. And for me, that is actually thinking in the context of technological automation and our jobs being taken away by robots and AI, etc. That is something that would breed true resilience. Not being uniform, not being within one slate of time, and combining so much of different knowledge. And I remember we had this dinner last week, and we started speaking how sometimes it's important to go back into something, to go back in history to find something. And a mutual friend at the table said, well, maybe go back is not the right notion. In the beginning I was like, no, but it's important to go back into some of these historical moments. And then further down the line as the conversation evolved, I was actually, you're right. It's not about going back, it's about going deep. It's about taking away these layers and the fluff of superficial ideas that do not represent reality. Going deep into and look forward to. So that's kind of what creativity so much is for me. And what's interesting as well, going on that practical level, what type of jobs, what type of professions, what type of people that would require. And most of these jobs, and most of that education, most of that training does not exist. Not just at schools, but not even within our imaginations. And I think there are a few places, like Mexico City, where such things could be explored and such opportunities could be found.
I had a conversation once upon a time with a friend that's an evolutionary biologist, and I was incredibly impressed by how they think about every time that a species goes extinct, because it's not only the sadness that the world no longer has white rhinos. For them, it's actually the fact that there's less DNA out there for future combinatory potential and possibilities of life taking on its own shapes and sizes down the future. And I have the feeling that this going deep that you're mentioning, and maybe this resurfacing, and yes, this notion that we don't even, I mean, it's not even wanting to go back to the past, but I do think that in places such as Mexico City, there is many things to be unearthed. Like, there are so many things that are not necessarily active in the way that we imagine, and how to be able to have that whole gamut that goes back into our very idiosyncratic self at the same time that we have access to everything that is contemporary, that is universal, and find that we can do different combinations with that, I think is one of the ways forward. Funnily enough, one of the books that I read recently as well was Harari but Sapiens, which is an amazing book. It's a big book, but if you guys step into it, that basically talks about, hey, like, why at one point in time the world, there were humans were much less important than bees how did we suddenly overrun the planet? And basically he says it's the capacity to imagine, and it ends up being culture, politics, and religion that lets us self-organize in more than 150 people. So it places culture right back at the very heart and at center, but also very poignantly, hien sapiens, where Homo Deus begins, of saying ideology is such right now in a neoliberal scheme that we can no longer imagine an outside. Like, it is what it is, and we do better or we do worse, and there's, we moderate it in different ways. But I know that you've been talking with my team as well on the need to actually think about different creative economies, and that does not necessarily mean different creative industries as we know them, though it can include them, but actually, as you well said, different social articulations and different urban commons and different creative commons as we know them and as we could explore. So could you tell us a little bit more about what is in your head regarding this?
The different future jobs, the different... Oh my God, there's so much. We started unearthing, obviously, a lot of interesting avenues from emerging professions such as people that I work with a lot, concept artists, that today will mostly work with entertainment and in the movie business. Yet we hired a concept artist to help us imagine the fictional future for the real city that Mexico City is. Then of course, everything that is today conceived as soft skill, that is so much undervalued. Why? Because so much of that are the skills that are feminine. And so much of that work is the work that historically has not even been paid for. And these are, again, the jobs that are the hardest to automate. And these are the areas as well where if we stop looking at it, if we stop looking at nannies, if we stop looking at doctors, if we stop looking at trainers, if we stop looking at sex workers, just as people providing basic service, but we start thinking of them as creatives. Instead of thinking of a sex worker, today the new emerging thing is the tantric massage. And I find it very interesting. I like to look at those areas that people don't normally talk about. When people talk about VR, so many people are hesitant to speak about VR porn. For me, it's important. So sex work is very interesting. It's been demonized, and yet we realize a society that is not sexually healthy is not healthy. Similar like families are not sexually healthy, are not healthy. And so by engaging with some of the people from the tantric massage community, I learned how, in fact, one could perceive it as a sexual massage, but in fact, these are the people that will train couples how to touch each other, how to explore each other's bodies, how to be happier together. Now tell me that is not a creative job. Today, we think, and that's a very important area that we started exploring, and something that I don't hear enough being spoken about in the context of the cities, is how the city could not just make human interaction safe, meaning let's focus on not, to prevent the abuse, to prevent rape, to prevent physical violence, etc. But actually, how could we imagine a city that makes physical interaction desirable, that invites our bodies to explore, not just the city, but each other? So of course, in the context of sustainability and future transportation, we speak how it's important for people to use bicycles and to walk and do that kind of stuff. Of course, in the context of the future of health and the continuously rising insurance premiums, we know that we will all have to make that many steps per day, etc. But it's still a very superficial discussion. Can we imagine how the city would make our physical interaction and movement and exploration something of a creative activity and a vital part in how we experience the city? How the city could invite us to look each other in the eyes, and how it could allow us to creatively explore what our bodies are capable of. So these are really, really interesting areas for me that, again, are not being spoken about. Everything around education as a creative discipline, everything around our physical presence as creative discipline. And then another key thing that I always think and speak about, we know that we have to learn how to collaborate with machines, AIs and robots. We're talking about. However, I call it hashtag question the algorithm. For me, that's one of the most interesting jobs of the future, and that is again a creative job. Asking new questions, questioning the choices that AI makes. Not just complementing the robots, but thinking what can we do that robots cannot do. These are all interesting things. And then coming back to this idea of the physical experience of the city, we know that with a lot of these, what we call cyborg technologies, what we could add to our bodies is new senses, new abilities to experience the city, to experience natural environment, to experience each other. Now, what happens when we add these additional senses? How our experience of the city changes, and how we come up with these ideas of what are the new senses that we want to add. How do we use technologies not just for practical purposes, but the purposes of joy and pleasure and connection and communication? So I think these are the key areas that we explored.
And going back to the writers, Nabokov was synesthetic, so now knowing that we can actually prompt that into us, it becomes an interesting provocation. So basically one of the things that we've been working on right now is how do we, as I mentioned, Monika is our more outlandish guest. A lot of our other future thinkers that will come have methodologies that are very serious and have already done work with other places, but we really wanted to start imagining far ahead and then coming back. It's also speaking very much to things that we have at the lab that I didn't talk about because they're still in process, but let's say Edgar here has Diseño para la Ciudad, which is basically has 5 working tables that have been meeting for many days with the designers of my team of thinking, what is the new role for designers in a society like this? What are the new skills that are needed? How do we sit the universities at the same table for the first time to talk about the future of education in terms of the skill sets that are being needed for this future designer? Paulina, that I saw around here, and Paulina, that is right there, in terms of both our creative city as well as open city agenda. I really do think that this city basically needs to provoke and prompt and again signal possibilities. So one of the things that we're working on, it's so hard nowadays to use the city for creative and cultural purposes. You can ask any of the big festivals, you know this. And the bureaucracy is huge. So one of the things that we're working on right now very closely with many actors from government as well as civil society is how do we make it very simple for the city to be used for any creative and cultural purpose. So these are the small glimpses, I believe, that are still very much in the ground, but that I think start basically throwing us toward that city that we imagine, because again, we're not going to do it except in bits and pieces. I actually think that one of the things that we're doing in terms of calling not only like these urban futures that we're tending towards in the huge buildings, but actually rehearsing the city, rehearsing the future. How do these small probes and prompt in different neighborhoods with different communities, with different people, even play streets, like a very simple thing that we brought back from the 70s with a pedagogical purpose and are now doing across Mexico City, have been incredible to see how communities respond. So I have, there's still a lot to talk of, but Gabi is telling me that we don't have that much time. So I'd be curious to know if there's questions. I know that there's several people that also had dinner and that are part of the futures table. So is there anything else, any additional provocations? Yeah, that's okay, great. So and then maybe we can just like let the voices in, and then if you want to have a little wrap up. And again, like this is still Monika's still with us for a while. She's only been here for a week and so this is 2 weeks now. This is the things that have been prompted, and again, like this is experiment of an experiment, letting loose these ideas that are still very much in nascent and in its forming stage. So anybody out there that wants to add something, maybe I want to go to the last point, and then we open to questions.
So I think with all this conversation about the creativity and how creativity could transform not just urban design, development, and urban experience, bottom line, what we have to think is how that transformation is not just cultural, not just social, but also political, technological, and last but not least, economical. One of the points that I find most crucial to understand is that we're coming to this realization that the current economic model doesn't work. It demands infinite growth within the world of finite resources. It's unsustainable. Yet, this economic growth is necessary for the countries not to collapse. So So I have this outlandish idea, as Gabriella might think, and I would like to imagine, and that was part of this whole exercise of thinking what role the creativity could play in the future, how we could shift from, we inherited degenerative economy. We live in this linear way of taking natural resources, turning them into goods, turning them into waste. It's unsustainable. But what if we imagine an economy based on experience and knowledge? Is infinite growth possible then? Well, I think it is. So could we imagine a future city where not, of course, the entirety of its economy is based on creativity and designing? What are these future designers? You just asked that question. But what if today we think of designers mostly as designing products? But can we think of designers as designing experiences and knowledge? And what does that really mean? And how it could mean that the city could continuously evolve and prosper economically as well. How we could raise the value not just for some, but for all of us. How we could change this paradigm of extreme inequality and strive for equality. That is difficult, but I think through creativity we could eliminate the extreme ends of it. And so I think that's the invitation for all of you and for the continuous work that we are yet to do, is how we could shift from these extractive economies to the economy of experience and knowledge, and think of an infinite growth within these two fields as our answer to make the future not just sustainable, but truly regenerative.
I was thinking about this crowdsourcing experiment we did with policy, the Constitution, and realized we already have a lot of community buildings. Like the basis or the most interesting parts of our communities are always the markets, but then the markets are taken over by, I don't know, politicians and stuff like that. Why don't we just take markets and make them cultural places, still allow people to have that, sell products and stuff? You know, all the markets in Mexico City are the same. They should be representative of their communities.
I agree. We have some of the other data in my head now since I came into government. We have 243 public marketplaces, and that's not counting the tianguis that pop up. And one of the tiny experiments that we did in Ciudad Ludica, like another team of the lab, was basically reimagining some of these spaces as a place for cultural and creative interaction, and supported Querenta, which is an amazing project in La Merced that is run by one of the inhabitants, like one of the neighbors for forever, and basically thinking about how can we start revisiting what the marketplaces have been. I'm very intrigued by urban commons. No, if we do the inventory of those things that belong to all of us as citizens of Mexico City, it's such a huge thing. And once again, going back to this combinatory possibility, if we make that part of the DNA, then the things to play with once again. I have the feeling that there's much to be thought and a lot of social systems to be brought into both, its past as well as contemporary space. So it's a great idea. So next government term.
I have actually several ideas as an outsider, not specifically for Mexico City, but for the world. I think it's interesting, a lot of art world is very much defined by snobism today. And I find it interesting when, again, we start decoupling these ideas of creativity from just art that is in museums and galleries and these fancy spaces that are by default exclusive rather than inclusive? And how could we bring the creatives, artists as well, but creatives at large, into these public areas? And here, do the very opposite of what Burning Man does. The whole idea of leave no trace, we create something and it's just a temporary and then it's gone, but actually invite the creatives to create something in the public spaces that is a creative expression, that is not just pure art, that is something that is applied and conceived for the community, and then it actually stays there. So the amazing project that Laboratorio para la Ciudad does is Pietoninos, where they close down the streets and the kids can play, but what if the creatives join there and together with the kids create objects and reimagine what the walls of those places could look like, and not just with art, but also with plant life, and plant things that are not just there to serve practical purposes to create oxygen and maybe give us food, but also are seen as creative interventions. So these things, for me, are very interesting possibilities. If we bring creatives outside the exclusive spaces, towards inclusive spaces, and think of how these creative pop-ups could just start happening everywhere in a way that is not snobbish at all.
Hi, Monika. With your background in virtual mixed and augmented reality, how is that fitting in together with the amazing project that the laboratory has? And what have you been working on, and what are you visualizing? And especially in terms of sustainability and having a creative economy that is growing in terms of creative experiences, and how's all that fitting? And I would like to see and to know if whatever you're creating, is it going to be available soon? And can you talk a little bit, please, about that?
Sure. Yes, I'm actually very involved in immersive media tech space. I was one of the earlier people with creative background in this third wave of VR to start messing with it and to start asking the kind of questions that nobody wanted to hear. And rather than just be, high-fiving people for the gadgetry of it all. What interests me with immersive media space is that differently than via the linear format that we currently have, documentary movies or articles about something, that remain very much top-down. I'm telling you what things are. I'm storytelling you what is wrong with this world or what should be done. What is interesting is that, for example, in a city with an AR overlay or in a virtual reality experience, you can bring people into a possibility space and make them experience something. And what interests me more than anything is how could you make them experience alternative realities? Right? So if there's a particular competition for a new green or creative space in a city, instead of just making one design and then it being judged by people somewhere up there, we can create an AR simulation that everybody in a city, all of its citizens, could go in and check all these different proposals and see too in that place. Or with VR, you could literally walk through alternative world, what the city could turn out to be, for example, with the timeline 2030, if we make certain choices, if we don't make certain choices, or if we're half-assed about the choices that we make. And then let people experience that and let them apprehend what that reality could mean. So this is, for me, the great opportunity with immersive media tech, is that it could allow us not just be told something, but really to experience a possibility space that we could then hopefully bring back into our physical lives. And that's what's been irking me so much, again, with especially VR industry and movies such as Ready Player One, is that it shows this technology as this pure escapist fantasy, as something that is very much entertainment. And then in corporate conferences, it tells you how it's going to increase the productivity. And it's not telling us, in one case, it's just making real life more efficient, in the other side, it's escaping the reality. But what interests me is how we could open up the field of possibility of reality with that digital overlay or the digital immersion, so that it would have real impact and ultimately expand the human potential, creatively, physically, intellectually, emotionally. Allow us to imagine different ways we could be. And then what's to come, that's a bit of a secret still.
No se preocupen porque ellas todavía no se van a ir. Es la última pregunta antes del cóctel y ahí van a poder acercarse y preguntarles directamente. ¿Bien?
We were talking about diversity and dystopias. What's happening now, I think, is something very strange because we are seeing like a new fascism growing, but hipsterizing, with a new face, with a very new chic face. People from the far right are coming with new clothes, new happy faces, say they are being discriminated. The white men, you know the stuff. But also I feel this whole thinking with new face is very linked to the fossil energy industries, the old economy. So my question is, how we can build this transition to a new economy, a new transformation, generative, sustainable economy, but also a new society with new values? Because these old values are taking new clothes, with new hipsterized faces, and saying, oh, women discriminate us, or gay people have special rights and this stuff. How can we make new dreams with new futures, without falling in the trap of this new chic fascism growing everywhere?
So obviously I'm quite aware of that. On Twitter every day I receive death threats and rape threats and all that kind of stuff, which hopefully would not translate into reality, but I'm always aware of it and have to be mindful, and so many of my friends experience way more of that. The YouTube video that I told you to check out, in fact, these friends of mine were forced, because they were questioning. You know, the main question they had is that, am I meant to admire the brushwork and the colors without considering how it came to be there? So actually being part of any minority within whichever context and daring to question how that particular thing came to be there makes you into an object for intimidation. So that particular video, they had to take it down for YouTube, and it was reposted by somebody who's a hater, and it's enough to just scroll down the comment section to just be beyond horrified of that particular reality. And so I want to read something I actually wrote down just last night. We think of colonialism as a thing of history, but we seem to fail to recognize the neo-colonialism all over the depictions of the future. And that's really, really important for me. And so, me who says nostalgia is poison, at the same time, it's important to take the layer, to peel the layers off and to go deep, not go back, go deep, and to start telling the real history. The reason why so much of that thinking is being amplified, because most people are not being taught the real history. And again, just talking with any of my friends of color, especially diaspora, and how they're being taught history at school, me thinking what kind of history I was told at school, and how it again omitted entire civilizations and continents, or whitewashed them, or male-washed them. So there is no future unless we actually re-examine well the past. And only in that way we'll be able to also live much better in the present moment. So these are other things that I wrote down a couple of days ago. The right to memory, the right to resistance, the right to the future. So how the city that we spoke about, the right to play, the right to engage, the right to make choices are important. So similarly this thing, the right to memory, the right to resistance, the right to the future. And I think that we're seeing this emergence of neo-fascism because so much of that right is being erased, and technology has been supporting that. And so much of that as well is being taken, that agency is being taken from the youth. We are and I know because I've been the recipient of that. Whatever idealistic ideas I've been had, countless adults told me, well, you're gonna grow out of that. Well, that's gonna pass. Well, why would you do that? You will risk, when I called out certain things in Hollywood, so many people were telling me you're not gonna have another job. And it's not that I wasn't afraid of that, but I knew that silence is violence. And it's not just actions that matter, it's inaction as well. Turning the other way around, back in the Nazi Germany, when your neighbors were taken away, oh, I didn't take them away, I didn't put them in concentration camps, but you were complicit. But this is, again, not just with the physical actions and things that happen, but also with the ideas. So we continuously have to stand up. And each of us have a certain amount of privilege. You know, I might be underprivileged in certain aspects as compared to, you know, rich, white, top, male CEO, but I'm so privileged. Each of us in this room is privileged in so many ways. And so how do we exercise our privilege on a daily basis is what tomorrow we will see. And how we can start questioning these ideas that superficially might seem seductive. And unless we do that, all of us together, and unless as well, not just the diaspora, but entire cultures and continents start to rise up, and we start thinking and realizing that the physical decolonization might have happened in the 20th century, but the cultural decolonization just started happening a couple of decades ago. And the decolonization of our imaginary may be starting to happen now. So what each of us in this room is doing about it?
Hello. Well, my question comes from a thought I had some months ago. I was watching a video where it said how the algorithms, like for example with the fake news, can control what we think even without us even noticing. And it came to me the idea, like, we jumped to the thinking and we don't pass to that process of feeling and thinking and really understanding things. We just believe we get it and go act on those ideas without the conscience. I think one of the problems of this society right now, some of the problems we've been talking about now, is about that jump into action, into productivity. And I believe one of the most relevant cultural changes, ideological changes, would be like teaching people to feel again and to understand themselves and to see themselves and the others. And how is this thing of re-educating us, humanity, to feel connects with this project, or is it considered in any part of the things we're talking about right now?
So I think it goes back to soft skills versus hard skills. And also sort of logical thinking and engineering, all that stuff being priced, and sort of the IQ always over EQ. And what we're realizing right now, and again, even Davos recognizes that, although it's still very much a superficial reading, is that emotional intelligence is one of the key skills towards the future. Because without it, we cannot collaborate. Without it, we cannot build teams. Without it, we continue fighting and competing rather than creating things together. What's interesting for me, you see with so much of the sci-fi, and again, when people think that I'm so much of a fan of so many things in the world of sci-fi, actually, I'm not. I'm in love with the potential of it, of how much it can be the change agent, but I'm very critical of what we have seen. What's interesting, and it ties back into the earlier conversation we had, the original, the Japanese Ghost in a Shell, the anime movie touches on the fallibility of the homogeneous systems. And the more similar all the parts are within the system, the easier they can be hacked. And so we started seeing that as a society as well. And so, I mean, me and my friends have been following what Cambridge Analytica has been doing way before it was in any realm of the public conversation. There's a very interesting movie called, it's on Stuxnet. My God, now I forgot the title, I'll remember afterwards. And it speaks about the cyber warfare and explores sort of the Stuxnet virus and the Pandora's box that it opened. What fascinates me is how in most of the sci-fi, with all these space operas and, you know, cyborgs going rogue and all these stories, they're very much a detraction from the real problems. And things such as cyber warfare with targeted misinformation and what would that mean for society, we have not seen that in the sci-fi realm. And these are very important things to explore, and that's what I always try to invite the creators, the sci-fi writers, directors, producers. Let's look into actual real problems and let's start putting them on, you know, into these wider audiences on a bigger screen so people can start thinking about it. And what's interesting for me with the fake news phenomenon is that the problem is not in the fake news. The problem is that it finds it's like seeds, right? That find fertile ground to grow in. And that is truly the biggest issue. And what it goes back into our education systems. That we are being trained as factory workers because education is not being considered a creative discipline. We're not being taught to really think. And think in that mindset of imagining a paradigm shift, in questioning the existing system. And so I think this problem will just continue being exacerbated unless there will be a real pushback with that. And again, we go back to the importance of creativity. And creativity that encompasses many different areas, and creativity that is very conscientious. Because personally for me, that was one of the biggest shocks during especially last election season, how many of my acquaintances with a creative background, even artists that I appreciate, etc., were completely deluded about what was happening politically. And were throwing at me insane conspiracy theories. To a point where I felt like I could barely engage or consider that they can be my friends. But then when I realized, it goes back to the lack of, within the world of creativity, of analytical thinking and skills and being connected to reality and thinking how we as creatives don't just exist in our room or in our vacuum, but we have to engage with the real world and its problems, not just to solve them, but to inspire our community and the citizens of this spaceship Earth to go and find ways to solve it themselves.
Well, thank you, Monika, for inspiring us.